Hi, everybody, and welcome. I think many of you have been to at least one workshop before, but you'll know that I'm just going to hang tight for a couple of minutes. Maybe we'll start at 12:01 just to give some people time to join. So thank you for joining, and we will get started shortly. All right, so I will get started with my introductory rigmarole to give some other people some time to join, but I do see some new participants have been joining in the last 30 seconds or so. So first I want to say welcome and thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. This is the second in the Writing Lab series this semester. If you've signed up for this one, you have seen the other workshops that are available. Today we'll be talking about topics, research questions, and thesis statements, questions that I get from a lot of students who are coming into the lab. So hopefully some of the tips I can give you today can shed some light on these processes. For anybody who has not been to the Writing Lab before or any of these webinars, my name is Charla Rivera, and I'm the director of the Writing Lab, and I've been the director of the Writing Lab since its inception in 2017. So if you have ever interacted with the Writing Lab before or will in the future, chances are we will cross paths. So, all right, so let's jump into the topic. In general, most of these workshops are going to be about 20 to 30 minutes long. Last week's a little bit longer just because that's a bigger topic, but I anticipate today will be done in 30 minutes or less. So here we go, not jinxing it, right? Also, one quick little housekeeping. Everybody here, when you join the meeting, is automatically muted. I do ask that while I'm giving the actual webinar that you do keep yourself muted, but I have the chat box open on my screen, and so if you do have any questions while I'm going, feel free to type your question, and then at the end of the webinar, you can feel free to unmute yourself or type additional questions or anything like that. All right, so let's get started. So we're going to jump right in and talk about choosing a topic, something that can be a little bit intimidating, especially if you're given an open-ended assignment. And I know a couple of you in attendance here today have emailed me saying, like, I have an independent study class this semester, and I'm not really sure what I should be doing for my topic. It is much, much harder to start an open-ended assignment. In some ways, open-ended assignments are more exciting because you can do whatever you want with them for the most part, but it can also make them a lot more scary because you don't have much direction at all, and it's much easier to work within the constraints that are given to you by a professor or an advisor. So it can be pretty intimidating to just come up with your own topic, okay? When you are choosing a topic for an open-ended assignment, so everything in this topic section is going to assume that you have a relatively open-ended assignment because if you don't have an open-ended assignment, there's no issue in the choosing a topic stage. So when you are choosing a topic, it's important to consider the length. So your professor may not have given you a topic, but it's possible that they do have some sort of expectation of length. So, you know, if it's an independent study class, then maybe your professor gives you several papers that are, 5 pages long, 10 pages long, or maybe you're writing something of capstone length, which is also its own little animal. But it is important to consider that length. That also, if you were here last week when we talked about the writing process and understanding your professor's assignments, you'll know that length also gives you some hints in terms of how much detail you can go into. So a shorter paper is going to have a different amount of detail than a longer paper. So thinking about length, not just in terms of like how much do I need to type in order to get the minimum, but in terms of, okay, how should I frame this topic if I only have 5 pages to talk about it? Or if I have to fill 50 pages? It's a different way of thinking, okay? We'll also think about the purpose, and you'll remember this from last week as well. What are you trying to do? So maybe your professor didn't give you much direction, but maybe they said, examine the definition of transhumanism over the course of history or something like that. I bring up that topic because I read a paper earlier this week about that. So maybe your professor didn't give you a clear topic, but they gave you a general time frame, or they gave you the definition of a word to examine or something like that, okay? An audience, which as you know is the most vague of the considerations, which it's often not expressed to you. But you can always double check with your professor, especially with an independent assignment, because maybe you do something that's not an academic style writing paper. Maybe instead you do a business plan or something like that, in which case your audience would be different than who your audience would be in a paper written for academia. Okay. And then also think about your own interest, especially if we're talking about something that's capstone length, because I can almost promise you, no matter how much you love your topic at the beginning of your capstone, you're going to hate it by November, December. So at least start with something that you somewhat like or are somewhat excited about it, because your positive feelings for that topic will probably fall off as the semester goes. And even if it's not a capstone, the more interested you are in the topic, the easier it's going to be for you to talk about. So don't choose something simply because it sounds good for your professor, although that is a consideration, but also how interested you are in it. Because like I said, you're going to be a lot more long-winded within reason if it's something that you are interested in, okay? Okay, so narrowing a topic. So choosing a topic is kind of just like a broad, okay, what is the general idea that I want to talk about? Narrowing the topic is exactly what it sounds like, really zeroing in on what specifically you are going to talk about. So if your topic is too broad, okay, too general, too broad, it means that you will have too much information and it will be really hard for you to decide what's important and what should ultimately be put in your paper, okay? It also means that you can't really integrate it easily into the one paper, and you might find yourself going off onto unfocused tangents, okay? So if your topic is too broad, you're really gonna have a hard job staying focused through the length of your paper. You're gonna go off on tangents, okay? So having a nice, clear, narrow topic will help you stay on track and keep you from getting sidetracked with those tangents. It can also, if it's really general information, it can really be hard for you to see or connect a pattern in the ideas. So that's what I mean by a theme or a framework. At its core, most academic writing is some sort of categorization. And if you have too much general information, it can be hard to decide what the categories should be, what should go in those categories. It's just too much, okay? And it can also be difficult for you to select your methodology. So if you're doing any firsthand research, primary research, where you are going out into the field, so to speak, and you are doing surveys or interviews or measurements of your own or anything like that, it can be hard to decide on that methodology if the topic itself is too broad. If you have decided, for example, let's say the topic of tobacco use, just say the topic tobacco use, and you want to study tobacco use. Well, when it comes to your methodology, what are you studying? You know, if you narrow your topic to tobacco use by teenagers, then you can start thinking, okay, maybe I'll survey teenagers. Maybe I'll interview some parents, you know, that kind of thing. So if you have a too broad of a topic, tobacco use, it's going to be hard for you to even select how to do your actual research as well, okay? There can sometimes be a problem of a topic being too narrow, but generally this is not the issue I see. Generally I see topics that are too broad. A topic can be too narrow, but I would say generally don't worry about your topic being too narrow unless maybe you're writing your capstone. If you're writing something of that length, then yes, you need something that's going to be able to stretch on over, you know, 50 pages. So, but generally for your everyday papers, it's going to be hard for you to make it too narrow. Not that it's hard to do, but it's just rarer to see. Okay, so in terms of how to actually narrow the topic, I'm going to go over, I think it's 6 or 7 different ways to consider how to narrow your topic. But basically, it all comes down to how can you break your topic into smaller pieces. So everything that I'm talking about here is going to be different ways to think about those pieces or different ways to identify pieces. But it all comes down to the same idea of breaking it into pieces. So narrowing a topic, you can think about it in terms of aspect. So if you're in a liberal studies class and you are writing a paper about, let's say, the use of food in Southeast Asian rituals, maybe that's going to be too broad. Maybe you want to specify the use of food in Hindu religious rituals. Or maybe you're going to look at just one type of food and explore it in different religions, that kind of thing. So rather than being really broad, food use in rituals in Southeast Asia, maybe it'll be better for you to think about it in terms of one specific religion or one specific food. Okay. Thinking about how your initial, I say variable, but basically your initial topic, how can things be broken into smaller parts? So for example, with my tobacco use example, tobacco use could be broken down into adolescent tobacco use, or you could break it up into just chewing tobacco or vaping or something like that. How can you break it up into its further components? So maybe you end up writing a paper about the use of vaping in the adolescent age group. So then you've narrowed it down from tobacco use to a specific population as well as a specific type of tobacco. Okay. Methodology, I talked about that. So it can help to consider how you, if you are doing primary research, how you plan to gather your materials for that research. So the way you gather your data or the type of data that you gather is going to inform the type of analyses that you can end up doing. So if you do some actual quantitative measuring where you're getting out there and you're crunching numbers and you're not doing interviews or anything, you're just pulling up raw data and you're crunching up numbers, that's going to be a different type of analysis and a different type of topic than a research project in which you are conducting interviews or sending out surveys. So thinking about what your methodology will be can inform your topic, as well as your topic can inform the methodology. It's kind of a cycle here. Thinking about your relationship, that this is related to what we were talking about last week in terms of purpose or structure. But are you doing compare and contrast? Are you doing problem solution? What's the actual relationship between the variables that you are looking at? Okay, and that can help you consider how you want to frame your topic. If ultimately you're going to do a problem solution, then maybe you leave out the part where you are, let's say we're talking about some sort of environmental issue. If we're talking about how to solve an issue like sea level rise, then maybe we're not doing a comparison of different types of climate change, how climate change manifests itself. Instead, we would focus only on the problem solution of sea level rise. Type, very similar to what I was talking about before with components. So thinking about different classes of people, age groups, race, gender, country of origin, linguistic background. There's any number of different populations that you could possibly look at. Same thing with places. Are you looking at a whole country? Are you looking at a region? Are you looking at just a city? Are you looking at one neighborhood? Thinking about that. And then phenomena, exactly what it sounds like. Are we looking only at storms? Are we looking at, that kind of thing? So really trying to narrow down what type. I do want to say you don't have to do all of these things. And like I was saying, they basically do all boil down to the same thing as how can you break up your topic into components. And it would be impossible for you to break something up in terms of all 6 or 7 of these, but these are just kind of different ways to conceptualize, okay? The place, like I said, consider if you're doing basically the smaller the geographic unit, the more narrow your focus will be. So, you know, focusing on the world, focusing on a continent, focusing on a country, a city, a neighborhood, a state, you know, those are going to have a different level of focus in there. Okay. And finally, time period. So maybe you're examining, if let's still consider maybe sea level rise. Maybe you want to look at sea level rise over the last decade versus looking at sea level rise over the past 100 years. How long you choose for a particular time frame is going to depend on the length of your paper and how much space you have to share these details. Okay. Now, I do really want to highlight that sometimes narrowing a topic can be one of the hardest parts, especially for an independent study or an open topic. So this is where having a discussion with someone can really help. If your professor has time, you can meet with them, or you can meet with a writing lab tutor to bounce some ideas around. A really, really common session that I have is to meet with students who have some sort of independent study project, or they're working on a capstone and they are really having trouble conceptualizing what their topic will look like. And so this is where it can really help to have somebody else to bounce your ideas off of. And you can also even just like meet with a classmate or a coworker who knows about your topic or something like that. Somebody who can really help you conceptualize what different components might be, or whether your topic is too broad or too narrow. It can really help to have a discussion at this stage. Okay. So I think that's all I have on topics. If you have any questions about narrowing a topic, feel free to type them in the chat, or you can ask me via your mic at the end. So now let's talk about research questions. So I'm kind of going in order here of how you might, in theory, be proceeding in a research paper. So first would be selecting your topic and narrowing that topic. And then once you have a topic, you would be forming your research questions. So what is a research question? A research question is basically what it sounds like. It's a question that guides and focuses your research. Your research should be an answer to your research question. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but it's really important to think about your research question as something that's going to guide you at every step, where you're saying, does this answer my research question? Does this answer my research question? And you can have more than one research question, especially once you have a longer paper, something like capstone length. It's totally acceptable to have more than one research question, okay? So when we're thinking about forming research questions, it should be clear, okay? A research question should provide enough specifics that the audience understands the purpose of the question without needing additional explanation. So your question should stand alone as a question. It should not need, you know, multiple pages of explanation. That said, if you do include a research question in an actual essay, it's very common that it comes after your introduction or somewhere. It's not often that a paper would just start with a research question. So it's not that you cannot give any background, but more that somebody in your field should be able to read that research question and understand your purpose without you having to do too much background explanation. It should also be focused, so similar to coming up with your topic, it really needs to be narrow enough that it can be answered in the space the writing task allows. And this is, again, really important. So the type of research question you might write for a 10-page paper is going to be inherently different than a research question that you write for a 50-page research paper, because it's going to be a different level of detail. Or you might include more than one research question in your 50-page paper and only do one in your 10-page. Okay. It should also be concise. So similar to the clarity without needing additional explanation, it should just be concise, short, sweet, to the point. Okay. And the question itself, or rather the answer to the question, should be complex. It should not simply be a yes or no. So your research question should generally not begin with the word do or does, since in English, the main possible answer to a question that starts with do or does is a yes or no. So if I can just read your question and grammatically say yes or no, then it is probably not a great research question. If you do have a sort of question where, or a type of research where you are kind of looking at yes or no, it can be better to frame your research question so that you're thinking about to what extent. So maybe you say, you know, does, I don't have any topics in my brain right now, but let's say, does this do that? Okay, basic frame for a research question. That's a yes or no question, but you can tack on to the end, to what extent? You know, if so, to what extent? Or even better, you could say, to what extent does X cause Y, or whatever. Although that one does have an underlying assumption of a causation. But thinking about a complex, open-ended question that requires you to do some analysis, to do some synthesis, and doing some research before you just come up with your answer. It should not be a simple yes and no, and it should also require some level of analysis. And it also should be arguable, and I'll talk about this with the thesis statements, but they should not just be accepted facts, okay? So, you know, the sky is blue, water is wet. These are not research topics. These are not research questions. There's no, nobody's arguing with you. So it should be something that is arguable, something that is open to debate, rather than something that's a simple fact. Okay. So here are some sample research questions. Okay, so here's an unclear research question. How should social networking sites address the harm they cause? If we're thinking about our topic idea, this is a very broad topic. There are many different types of social networking sites out there now. So how you talk about Facebook or Twitter or Instagram is going to be different from how you talk about TikTok or Marco Polo or some of the other social networking sites that are out there. So that part's a little bit too broad. And then also the harm they cause. What kind of harm are they causing? There are many different types of harm that we could look at in terms of what social networking sites do. We could look at misinformation. We could look at self-image. We could look at the dangers of doxing people and putting out their addresses. So what type of harm specifically are we talking about? So what type of networking sites, what type of harm? So a clearer research question would be, what action should social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter take to combat the spread of misinformation? Okay, this is still concise. It's longer than the other one, but it's clear. It's to the point. It has a clear purpose. Okay, this is a much more focused research question that is going to lead to a much more successful paper. Here's another one. What is the effect on the environment from global warming? Super broad, because there's many different types of effects and different causes of global warming and climate change, things like that. It's better to break things down into the relative components. So thinking about what are some actions city planners can take to mitigate the effects of sea level rise and floods. So here we've narrowed our topic not just on a specific type of climate change, being sea level rise and flooding, but also a specific audience for that. So city planners. What can city planners do to mitigate the effects of sea level rise? We're not even necessarily looking at the causes of sea level rise. We're not looking at other aspects of it. We're looking at, okay, if you're in urban planning, what can you do to mitigate the effects? Okay, so we have narrowed both the type of, both the topic of the global warming climate change, as well as the audience or intended, I guess, variable here in who you're talking about. Okay. Here we have a research question that's too simple. How are doctors addressing diabetes in the US? Okay. Again, diabetes is a very complicated disease. It has many different factors that that come into both the diagnosis of diabetes and the treatment of diabetes. It's a really complicated animal. And so it's just very simple to just say, you know, how are they addressing diabetes? Okay. And appropriately complex. Now notice that when I say something needs to be concise, it does not mean it needs to be short. It just means as short as it can be, no longer than it needs to be. Okay. So here's an appropriately complex research question. So what main environmental, behavioral, and genetic factors predict whether Americans will develop diabetes, and how can these commonalities be used to aid the medical community in prevention of the disease? This would equal a very strong paper, which would have 2 sections where you're talking about the factors that go into the development of diabetes and then the treatment of diabetes. So this would be a very strong paper, probably on the longer side. Okay. I think that's it for my research questions. Okay, yeah, quick rule of thumb for your research questions. If you can answer your research question with a quick Google search, then it's not effective. If you can answer it with a yes or no, it's not effective. It's going to need to require some amount of research, some amount of analysis, and some amount of synthesis in order to arrive at your answer. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about thesis statements. Okay. A thesis statement, so what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement explains the main controlling idea of the entire paper in one sentence. It's kind of like your elevator speech, or it's even shorter than the elevator speech, like walking by somebody on the street speech. Okay, so it's one sentence, or it could possibly in some cases be 2 sentences, but in general, you're gonna wanna try to aim for 1, okay? And a thesis statement directly answers your research question. So if your research question is, what are some actions city planners can take to mitigate the effects of sea level rise? Then your thesis statement would be, you know, some actions that city planners can take to mitigate sea level rise are da, da, and da. I'm not an urban planning expert, so I don't know the answers. But you would just frame your thesis statement so that it's a direct answer to your research question. Okay. It also, similar to your research question, needs to be concise and specific. Being concise is important because we're talking about 1 sentence, tops 2 sentences. Okay. It also needs to be arguable. Again, you can't just do something that's simply a fact. Okay. It needs to be something that someone could disagree with, or that there are multiple facets that you would need to explain. A thesis statement is also a roadmap to your paper. So however I talk about the ways that city planners can mitigate sea level rise, if I say A, B, and C, these are the 3 different ways to mitigate it, then I would talk about A first, and then I would talk about B, and then I would talk about C, okay? So whatever order you present your information in your thesis statement should mirror the order that you'll talk about it in your paper itself. It also usually, well, it's always located near the beginning of your paper, and it's usually near the end of the introduction. So if you have a shorter paper where your introduction is just 1 paragraph, then often it's the last sentence. If it's a longer paper, then maybe your thesis statement is kind of couched later in another paragraph, but it usually is located somewhere at the end of the introduction. Okay, I already said this, okay. So I'm gonna go over some thesis statement examples, and we're gonna talk about, you know, why they may or may not be strong. So I'm gonna be slightly over my promised 30 minutes, but not by too much, okay? So let's say you have an assignment in which you're supposed to compare and contrast the reasons why the North and South fought the Civil War. We could do a thesis like this one. The North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons, some similar and some different. This is not a strong thesis, okay? This would not be a strong topic. It is way too broad, okay? Many reasons, some similar and some different. Like, give me an idea of what some of those reasons would be, okay? This is way too broad, super vague, and the more specific you can be in these steps, the topic, the research question, and the thesis, the easier it's going to be for you to write your paper. It would be really hard to write this paper because you won't have a clear direction. But when you have a clearer thesis, a more focused thesis, then it's going to be easier to actually write the rest of your paper. So let's look at this copy. So same topic. Well, both sides fought the Civil War over the issue of slavery. The North fought for moral reasons while the South fought to preserve its own institutions. This is much stronger. It's much stronger. And I could see here where you would write about, in this paper, you might talk about slavery in the United States first, and then you might talk about some of the moral reasons why the North was fighting the Civil War, and then you might talk about some of the reasons why the South was fighting the Civil War to preserve its own institutions. Okay, but even stronger would be this thesis. While both Northerners and Southerners believed they fought against tyranny and oppression, Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their own right to self-government. Okay, so notice that the assignment is compare and contrast. Compare means you're talking about similarities, and contrast means you're talking about differences. So this thesis is covering both of those purposes. While both Northerners and Southerners believe they fought against tyranny and oppression. Comparison. Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their own right to self-government. Contrast. Okay, so this is a much stronger thesis, although the one that I showed you just previous to this is also pretty strong. I wouldn't complain. So here are the three just compared if you want to see them side by side. Thesis number 2 and 3 would be the strongest ones, with number 3 being the most specific and concise with the clearest idea of where your paper is going to go. Okay. All right, so how do I write a thesis statement? I'm going to go over this very quickly. So you'll consider the type of essay. These are kind of the purposes that we've talked about that can help you think about how you're going to form your thesis statement. Also consider what you want your main idea and supporting point to be for your entire paper, okay? And again, this is the one I'm going to highlight because I think this is the one that's easiest to do. Consider how to directly answer your research question, okay? So what makes a good thesis? Like I was saying before, it needs to be concise, needs to be specific, okay? This one is not concise or specific, but this one is. It also needs to be parallel, which is a grammatical sense. I do have a video on parallelism on the blog, so if you're interested, you can go on the SCS Writing Lab website, and I believe it's from November 2018 maybe, or maybe 2017. It's from a couple of years ago, but I have a video about parallelism. But parallelism is a grammatical idea. I'll have a quick example for you here. Not understanding how other cultures communicate can lead to misunderstandings, miscommunication, and causing other problems. This is not parallel because of the word causing, and I can go into more of that detail in the video about parallelism, okay? To sort of fix that, you would say misunderstandings, miscommunication, and other problems, okay? A good thesis needs to be arguable, so it can't just be a fact. So The Hunger Games is a science fiction adventure film. That's a fact. Nobody's going to argue with you that this movie exists and what genre it is. Instead, if you say it's a morality tale about the dangers of a political system that's dominated by the wealthy, then that's something that someone could argue about and or you would need to prove your thinking for. Okay? All right, so I'm 4 minutes over time, not too bad. So here is where I will pause. If you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. If you need to go make yourself a sandwich before your 1 p.m. Class, feel free. Yeah, so I'll hang tight for a few minutes to see if there's any other questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions via email, and I hope to see you guys next week or at a future workshop.
Thank you, Charlotte, for everything that you explained. I just have a question. Will you be sending the recording to the group?
I will. Every time. That's my plan. In the past, I didn't do it that way, but now my plan will be everybody who registers for the workshop will get a copy of the recording, and or my PowerPoint or other materials, because I know that we all have kind of crazy schedules right now. So
yeah, it's very helpful to
yeah.
review too.
And
Thank you very
also,
much.
yeah, for you to review later, because some of the topics here are a little heady. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. I can absolutely talk more about parallelism. If you actually want, I can pull up an old PowerPoint in which I talk about that one. In an older version of this same workshop, I talked about parallelism, but it ended up being cut so that I could hit the 30-minute mark or close to. But if you guys have time to hang tight for a second, I can talk about parallelism with you guys. Just one second. This is more of like a bonus workshop. So if anybody needs to go, feel free. But if you have 5 minutes to talk about parallelism, we can do that. All right, just a second for me to open that PowerPoint here. So parallelism, like I said, is a grammatical point where basically what you want is the same type of word to be repeated in a sentence. And the reason I bring it up in terms of thesis statements is because thesis statements tend to be formed as sentences with lists. So, you know, different actions city planners can take to mitigate climate change are A, B, and C. We have a list. And it's really important that when we have a sentence with a list, that grammatically the items in those lists are the same grammatical category. So let's look at what that means. So it means you're using a similar pattern when you write. So maybe you're using all nouns or all verbs or all adjectives, all words that end in ing, okay? I won't get into the finer points of the grammar here, but basically that the words are interchangeable with each other in terms of the grammar. It helps make your sentences flow and your writing much clearer, okay? And like I was saying at the very beginning, since thesis statements tend to contain lists, and because thesis statements are a very important part of your paper, it's really important to make sure that your thesis statement is well written and clear, and that includes parallelism. So I have some examples. So here's an example here. A battery powered by aluminum is simple to design, clean to run, and it is inexpensive to produce. This is not perfectly parallel because we have this extra it is. So we have simple, clean, and inexpensive, but in between for that last one, we have the words it is, okay? So it just kind of makes the rest of the sentence feel a little bit clunky. So we can rewrite this by just getting rid of it is, and say, so now our battery is simple to design, clean to run, and inexpensive to produce. I could rewrite these in any order. They'd be interchangeable with each other in that list, okay? Here's another one. The delegates spent the day arguing with one another rather than work together to find common solutions. If you're a native speaker, you probably even heard me hesitate as I got here because it's hard to actually say this one as non-parallel, but it's very easy to write. So you'll notice that I have arguing and work. The delegates spent the day arguing. The delegates spent the day work. So if you can't match it with the previous part of the sentence, then it's not parallel. Again, the delegates spent the day arguing, works. Yeah, that's just fine. The delegates spent the day work, not grammatical, okay? So to make it parallel, we would say the delegates spent the day arguing with one another rather than working together to find common solutions. The police have a duty to serve the community, safeguard lives and property, protect the innocent against deception, and they must respect the constitutional rights of all. Again, similar to the other one, we do not need the words, so we have the verbs serve, safeguard, protect, and respect. We have no need for the words they must, because in all of these cases, we can say the police have a duty to serve. They have a duty to safeguard. They have a duty to protect. They have a duty to respect, okay? In that case, all of those verbs can fit in together, so we don't need the words they must. It kind of messes up with the flow of the sentence, so we can get rid of those when we're reading the sentence itself, okay? So that's an earlier version of this workshop in which I went into more detail on parallelism. Okay. And there's more examples or maybe similar examples on the parallelism video that's on the website if you want to go check it out.